It wasn't just cold. It was something far older, far deeper than that. It crept in long before the sun vanished from the sky, long before the rivers froze and the trees cracked open like bones under pressure. This cold didn't whisper, it roared. It wasn't a season, it was a force, ancient and merciless, draped in silence and snow. The people didn't yet have a word for winter, the way we understand it. For them, it was simply the change, a turning of the world into something hostile. One day, the air turned sharp. Then the animals vanished. Then the earth turned to ice. And then the fear began. Everything slowed. The forest, once filled with rustling and running and life, became a still grave of frozen roots and empty trees. Footsteps stopped echoing. Even the wind didn't howl. It scraped. These were not poetic observations for the early humans. These were warnings. The silence of the forest wasn't peaceful. It was a signal that something had gone terribly wrong. There was no preparation, no storeroom, no weather forecast. There were only instincts and memory, vague memories passed from old mouths to young ears around fire pits, stories that once sounded like myths, now suddenly pressing against the skin like frost. The last berries had long shriveled. The animals that hadn't migrated had vanished into dens or fallen under the snow. The familiar trails through the woods disappeared, smothered by white drifts. The small group huddled together in the dim glow of their fire, the flames crackling like distant voices. The air inside the cave was thick, not with warmth, but with tension. Not all would make it to the thaw, and they knew it. The youngest cried quietly. His face was thin, his eyes too large for his skull. He did not understand why the grown ones looked at him with such stillness, such calculation. There were no screams, no panic, just a chilling awareness that each moment stretched thinner than the last. Hunger was not new to them, but this was different. The fire was fed with what little they had left, dried moss, twisted roots, even bits of clothing. Each flame bought a few more minutes of warmth, of sanity. But fire is greedy. It consumes without mercy, just like the cold. Outside, snow drifted against the entrance like a slow-moving avalanche. Somewhere beyond that wall of white, the world had gone still. No bird calls, no branches breaking, only that hollow, pulsing silence that said, "You are alone." And yet deep within the cold, the people stirred. They were not creatures of comfort. They were survivors. Their minds did not break. They sharpened. They began to watch one another differently. They began to plan. They didn't have time for despair. One figure, tall, lean, wrapped in furs turned stiff with frost, stood near the edge of the cave. He was not the leader by choice, but by consequence. He had hunted before, and he had failed before, and yet now all eyes turned to him. He didn't speak. No one did. There was no language yet for desperation this deep, but they understood what needed to happen. He would go. Alone or with another, it didn't matter. Someone had to face the frozen unknown. Someone had to bring back food, or not come back at all. In his hand, he held a spear, crude, worn, its stone head lashed to the shaft with sinew that had cracked under the dry air. It was not enough, but it was all they had. And then he stepped outside. The cold hit him like a wall. It burned before it numbed. His breath turned solid in the air, falling like dust. With each step, the snow clawed at his ankles, trying to pull him under. The world was nothing but white and gray and silence. He paused at the edge of the clearing, scanning the endless void. Somewhere out there, In this icy prison was something alive. It had to be. The people inside were counting on that belief. He pulled the fur tighter around his face, not to stay warm, but to keep moving. To stop was to surrender, and he hadn't come this far to stop now. Behind him, the cave had gone quiet again. Inside, firelight flickered, eyes waited, hearts slowed, and outside the storm swallowed his footsteps as if he had never existed. But he did exist. He walked, and with each step he carried not just a spear, but a question, one that haunted every soul clinging to life in the age of the cold. Can man survive a world that wants him gone? The meat had run out days ago. What little they had scraped from the last hunt, gristle, sinew, marrow cracked from brittle bones, was long gone, boiled until tasteless in a pot of melted snow, its memory lingering only in the quiet gnawing of jaws that chewed on emptiness. The cave, once echoing with quiet murmurs and the crackling rhythm of a steady fire, had fallen into a stillness that was not peace, but exhaustion. Hunger was no longer a passing discomfort. It had sunk into their bones, changed the way they looked at each other, frayed the thin threads of patience, and made every glance a silent question. The children no longer whimpered. They had learned already that crying wasted energy. One girl, barely old enough to walk before the snows came, sat with her back against the stone wall, her face pressed into a fur that no longer held warmth, her eyes not blinking, but watching. She didn't look at anyone in particular, just stared, as if trying to remember a world where food arrived without agony. The fire, once their guardian and center of life, had shrunk to a frail glow. It devoured everything they fed it: twigs, dry dung, shredded bark, pieces of woven mats torn from the floor, but it gave back less and less each time, until it seemed only to light the darkness without pushing it away. The walls of the cave began to sweat with ice. The frost crept inward, curling over the rocks like fingers closing into a fist. Those who still had strength moved slowly, deliberately, conserving every motion as if each one cost a piece of their soul. The older ones stared into the fire, but their thoughts were elsewhere. The younger men exchanged glances in silence, all of them knowing what needed to be done, but none of them ready to say it aloud. It had snowed all night. Not the soft, drifting snow that blanketed the forest in silence, but the brutal kind, whipped by wind that screamed through the trees and flattened paths into blank, white wilderness. No one spoke of venturing out during the storm. They knew better. Even the memory of the last time someone tried, when two men left and only one limped back, half mad and empty-handed, hung in the air like smoke. And yet now, the storm had passed, and the sky, though colorless and cruel, no longer spat snow. That, they knew, was not a reprieve, but an opening, a narrow window, a chance that would not wait. The question was not whether to hunt. That had already been answered in the hollow stomachs and sunken cheeks of the group. The real question was who would go and what they would risk. Every step away from the cave was a gamble. No trails remained. No animals had been seen in weeks. But hunger made cowards brave and turned calculation into instinct. The man who had gone out before, tall, silent, wrapped in frost-bitten furs, still had not returned. Whether he had found food or fallen, or simply vanished into the white, none could say. Hope had faded quietly without ceremony. And so the debate began, not with words, but with eyes, gestures, the slight tilt of the head, or the shift in position near the fire. One man stood, not the strongest, but perhaps the one who could not bear the stillness anymore. He looked toward the mouth of the cave, then back to the others, and they understood. No one stopped him. No one encouraged him. They just watched, because watching cost nothing. His spear was shorter than most, its head chipped from use, its binding worn thin. But he tied his belt tighter, wrapped his legs, and stepped out without waiting for ceremony. Another man followed, unspoken but understood, and together they moved toward the unknown, driven not by courage but by the terrifying knowledge that staying meant disappearing. Inside the cave, a strange kind of silence settled, less tense, but more hollow. Those left behind didn't relax. They merely resumed waiting. Waiting had become a skill, honed like a blade. Sit still, breathe slow, think little. The fire snapped suddenly, spitting sparks into the dark, and someone stirred to feed it a final twig. One of the children reached out toward the heat with trembling fingers and whispered something no one could hear. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, but the cold had not gone anywhere. It waited, just like them. There was once a time when the forest spoke to the hunters. In the warmer moons, the ground was soft enough to hold the imprint of hooves and paws. The brush snapped under movement, and the wind carried the scent of prey like a whispered map. Even in the darkness, even in the rain, the land gave clues to those who knew how to listen. But now, in this frozen world, the forest had gone silent. Not peaceful, silent. There were no sounds to interpret, no scents to follow. The snow was everywhere, layered deep and smooth, swallowing footprints almost the moment they were made. Wind moved across the landscape like a veil, erasing everything it touched. A hunter might kneel to examine a mark, only to see it vanish beneath drifting powder as he watched, as if the earth itself conspired to hide what little life remained. The two men who had left the cave that morning had gone in a direction no one had tried before, not because they expected success, but because every known trail had already failed them. The deer paths were long buried. The river was sealed with ice so thick it muffled even the memory of water. There were no birds overhead, no calls from trees, no rustle in the underbrush. It was as if every living thing had vanished, retreated underground, or given up the fight altogether. The snow underfoot creaked with a dead weight, offering no clues, no stories. The world no longer whispered, it hid. They moved slowly, stopping often not to rest, but to watch. The eyes worked harder now, scanning for contrast, for the tiniest break in the flat white. A patch of shadow that didn't belong, a flicker of motion against the wind. The old rules didn't help. Where once a broken branch might have meant a passing animal, now it meant nothing. The snow broke everything. Where once the wind brought warning, now it just froze the breath in their mouths and numbed the skin around their eyes. One of them crouched, pressing his gloved hand into a shallow depression in the snow. Was it a track? A print? He couldn't tell. It could have been made hours ago or a moment before. It didn't matter. The snow made liars of everything. The frustration sank in quietly, not with a shout but a tightening in the chest. Each step took energy. Each mistake burned time and hope. They circled back once, then again, mapping wide arcs, hoping instinct would do what skill could not. The forest grew denser ahead, black trunks like spears rising from a grave of snow. Beneath the branches, perhaps something moved, but they couldn't hear it. The cold had dulled the world's sound until it became a void. Even the breathing of the other man seemed far away, thin and dry and slow. They came upon a place where the snow was uneven, patted down in a way that suggested movement. Not definite, but enough to stir a flicker of intent. One of them knelt again, pushing aside the top layer, revealing disturbed earth beneath. There, hair, short, coarse, clinging to the frost. A sign, at last. His hands trembled not from fear or cold, but from the sudden jolt of purpose. The animal was close. It had to be. The snow hadn't yet filled this shallow bed. That meant minutes, maybe less. Without speaking, they split. One went wide, flanking the edge of the grove, careful not to crack branches, careful not to sink too deep. The other crept forward, using what little cover the trees provided. Every movement was deliberate, every breath shallow. Somewhere ahead, something was alive, not just imagined or hoped for, but real. The idea alone was enough to sharpen their senses beyond fatigue. Then a flash, just ahead, a blur of brown and white, bounding low through the snow. A hare, starved and frantic just as they were. It darted left, then right, vanishing between the trees. The hunter raised his spear, but it was already gone. He cursed beneath his breath, not at the animal, but at the snow, at the betrayal of the world that once taught them how to track, how to hunt, how to feed their own. Now it was as if the forest had turned its back on them, leaving them to wander through shadows and illusions. The sun, pale and hollow behind a sheet of gray, gave no heat, no guidance. Time lost meaning in the silence. Hunger gnawed with every step. The signs had come too late, and the chance had vanished like breath in the wind. They trudged on, not toward anything, but away from failure, desperate to return with something, even if it was only the knowledge of what didn't work. For in this kind of cold, even a lesson could be a lifeline. In the days before the freeze, hunting had often been a solitary task. One man, one spear, one trail. The forests then were rich with life, and even a single skilled tracker could return with enough to feed his own. But now, in the silence of winter, isolation meant failure. The cold was too absolute, the prey too scarce, the terrain too treacherous. Instinct shifted. Survival demanded something deeper than strength or speed. It required synchronization. They could no longer afford to hunt as individuals. The wild had changed its rules, and so too did they. When the third hunting group left the cave, it did so not as three separate men, but as a single mind spread across multiple bodies. Each had a role, unspoken but understood. Words were too loud now. Even a whisper could fracture the stillness and send a starving animal fleeing into the white haze. Instead, they used eyes, fingers, and breath. A nod, a glance, a slight movement of the hand. These were their language now. The lead, the one with the sharpest eyes, took the front. His job was not to chase, but to notice. Subtle indentations, shifts in snow texture, marks left not an hour ago by hooves that had barely grazed the ground. Behind him, the second moved in half steps, eyes never on the ground, but lifted to the trees and to the distant swirls of powder dancing in the air. He watched the wind, its direction, its rhythm. If they moved with it, the scent of human presence would spread ahead like a warning bell. They had to work against it, even if it meant hardship. The third kept distance, circling out wide, his steps measured and slow. He was the shadow, the trap. If they flushed prey forward, it would not run wild. It would run into him. If something turned on them, it would face a spear it hadn't expected. He was not the strongest, but he was calm, and calm was what winter required. They reached the ridge by mid-afternoon, though the sky gave no indication of time. Above them, the trees thinned, and below stretched a basin where brush, once thick, now stood brittle and low under the weight of snow. It was the kind of place where deer might linger, half hidden, drawn to the memory of shelter. The men spread wordlessly. Each took position, sinking into the stillness like stones. Their breath came slow and shallow, eyes darting but hands steady. The waiting began. Movement, when it came, was barely movement at all. A twitch in the brush, a break in the pattern of white. A small group of thin-bodied deer, ribs visible even from a distance, edged into view. Not many. 2 grown, 1 young. Desperation made them bold. Hunger had stripped away their caution, just as it had stripped the men of comfort. This was not a fair hunt. It was hunger clashing against hunger. The leader made the first move, a slow shuffle that pushed the deer toward the basin. The wind cooperated, trailing their scent behind them, not ahead. The deer paused, sensing something but not enough to flee. The second hunter remained invisible, adjusting his stance only to mark the direction of the gusts, calculating the next moves as if reading a language only he could understand. The third crouched behind a snow-covered fallen tree, his muscles coiled but quiet. He knew the others were moving even if he couldn't see them now. Trust bound them tighter than rope. When the deer moved again, it was toward him. He could almost hear their hooves crunching softly over the snow, each step laced with suspicion. A sharp, bird-like whistle broke the silence. Short, high, unnatural. A signal. The deer froze. Then another sound came, deeper, from the opposite side. The second signal. It meant now. The third man rose, not fast, but deliberately, just enough to break the line of white and draw the animal's attention. The young one bolted left, directly into the path of the lead hunter's throw. The spear, loosed with a practiced motion, flew across the snow and struck clean, not instantly, but deep enough. The deer staggered, flailed, then fell. The others fled, but there was no chase. The men had their goal. One was enough, more than enough. They approached slowly, reverently. This was not a celebration. It was an exchange, life for life. They knelt beside the animal, steam rising from its body, and touched it not with joy, but with the grim satisfaction of a pact honored. Together, they cleaned the kill. The heart was removed first, offered to the fire when they returned. It was not ritual in the modern sense. It was memory, a thank you, a reminder. They bound the legs and lashed it with rope, then began the long march home, the weight shared across 3 backs. It would feed them, not forever, not long, but long enough. And in the world of snow and silence, long enough was everything. The snow muffled footsteps, absorbed voices, and dulled the clash of branch against wind, but it could not hide the scent of blood, nor could it disguise the sharp change in atmosphere when something with hunger in its eyes decided to follow. As the 3 men struggled through the thickening drifts, with the frozen weight of the deer lashed across their shoulders, their bodies already stiff from exhaustion and cold, a different kind of tension began to rise. Not the kind born of fatigue, but of awareness, ancient and immediate, the kind that bypassed thought and settled directly into the spine. Something was watching, not a ghost, not a memory, but something with teeth. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. Each of them had already seen the shift in the wind, the absence of birds, the unnatural quiet ahead, the way the forest, though seemingly unchanged, felt smaller, tighter, as though it had drawn its breath and was waiting to exhale. They adjusted their pace without a word, moving slower now, more deliberately, the man on the right loosening his grip on the binding rope and quietly sliding his fingers toward the shaft of his spear, while the one in the rear turned his head only slightly, catching the faintest hint of movement between two trees, so fast and smooth it could have been imagined, but it wasn't. Then came the sound, barely audible at first, a soft repetition of snow being crushed under steady paws, growing more distinct with each step they took. And then they saw them, low to the ground, thin but sharp, gray shapes weaving silently through the undergrowth, not charging, not retreating, simply keeping pace, measuring. These wolves were not the sleek, confident hunters of early autumn, when prey was plentiful and the pack moved as a storm across the land. These were desperate creatures, ribs protruding, eyes sunken, fur matted with frost and filth. They did not howl or snarl. They simply followed, as if they knew that time and cold would do part of the work for them. The men could feel the rhythm of pursuit. It was patient. Wolves in winter had no need to rush. They knew what men rarely admitted. Fatigue was the deadliest weapon. It made the strongest hand slow and the keenest mind unsure. The deer, heavy and frozen, began to feel heavier with each step, not just in the muscles, but in the mind, dragging behind them like a question they could no longer afford to ask. Then one wolf drew closer, breaking from the trees, not in an attack but a test, padding within sight just long enough to meet a man's gaze before slipping back into the white. It was followed by another, this time approaching from the opposite side, slower, closer, letting its body be seen before vanishing again. It was a pattern, a language of pressure and patience, meant to unsettle, to fracture unity, to push them into a mistake. And then it happened. A sudden lunge from behind, fast and low, a blur of fur and muscle, aimed not at the men but the carcass. The youngest hunter turned instantly, his arm already in motion, and his spear landed just short of the attacker, enough to drive it back, but not enough to end the threat. The pack hesitated only for a breath, and in that breath, the hunters tightened formation, backs nearly touching, weapons ready, eyes scanning every angle. They would not abandon the meat, not after what it had cost, but they knew now what they were facing. These wolves had made a choice. This was no accident. This was a siege. One of the men began to speak, not in words, but in short, controlled grunts, coded sounds they had developed over many dark months of hunting together, a language shaped by the necessity of silence. His signals meant flank left, watch high ground, brace. They shifted as instructed, adapting to the pressure, never allowing the deer to be isolated. Another wolf lunged, this time from the front, but the man in its path met it with a long sweep of a branch, thick and frozen, striking with enough force to send the animal tumbling backward into the snow. It scrambled to its feet, growled low, not in pain but in frustration, and disappeared again. Time stretched. The wolves did not leave, but they did not attack again. They followed, always just out of reach, waiting for one of the men to stumble, to lag behind, to misstep on the icy terrain. They were not wild in the sense of chaos. They were precise, deliberate, like hunters who had learned that sometimes the best kill comes not from speed, but from watching your prey undo itself. And the men felt it. They felt the edge of fear, not the kind that makes you scream or run, but the kind that sharpens breath and blurs the line between predator and prey. They weren't just carrying meat anymore. They were carrying a challenge, dragging a line of blood through the snow that marked them, not just to wolves, but to anything else still breathing in the forest. The sun had already begun to sink, though it offered no warmth and barely any light. Shadows lengthened, and with them, so did the stakes. The wolves would not attack again before nightfall, but nightfall would change everything. The men picked up their pace, each step heavier than the last, knowing that when the dark finally settled, only one truth would remain. The hunters were not alone in their hunger, and in winter, it is not always the one with the spear who survives. Their world had shrunk to the space between heartbeats. The wind no longer howled, it pressed, thick and heavy, folding around them like a weight. Every sound, every movement, every breath was now a calculation. The deer they had lost earlier had not been a mistake of skill, but of timing, and they knew that in this season, time was the one element no one could bend. Snow no longer crunched beneath their feet. It swallowed them, dragging at their legs with every step. Hunger had carved their faces into pale masks, skin drawn tight over bone, eyes darting with the kind of urgency that left no room for doubt. Their bodies ached, but it was the kind of ache that had fused with thought itself, becoming part of the rhythm, something no longer felt, only carried. The three of them stood motionless at the edge of the frozen glade, hidden beneath the drooping arms of a pine weighed down with ice. Before them, not 20 strides away, stood the animal. It was alone, thin, trembling, its ribs fluttering with shallow breaths. A young reindeer, separated from the herd, too slow to keep pace, too young to have learned better. It had found a pocket of moss beneath a drift and was pawing at the frozen earth, unaware that it had wandered into the orbit of men with nothing left to lose. No one moved. The lead hunter's hand rested lightly on the shaft of his spear, his fingers locked in place not from hesitation, but from the cold that had stiffened every joint. He had only one throw. That was not metaphor. They had only one usable weapon left, with a stone head sharp enough to pierce and strong enough to hold. The others had been dulled, cracked, or lost during their last struggle with the wolves. One throw, one breath, like one chance to buy another night alive. The second man crouched just behind him, eyes not on the deer, but on the wind. It was shifting again, curling sideways through the trees, threatening to carry their scent directly toward the animal. They had minutes, no, seconds. Any longer, and the chance would vanish like all the others. The third man had already begun moving wide, slow and low, vanishing into the side of the clearing where shadows merged with stone. His job was simple. If the spear failed, he would drive the deer toward the trap they had dug earlier that day, an open pit masked with snow and brush, shallow but deadly. But they all knew better. If the throw missed, the animal would bolt, and the wolves would be back before they could recover. The lead hunter exhaled once. The mist of his breath drifted toward the treetops. He tightened his grip. The air burned his lungs, not with heat, but with silence. Every part of him, shoulders, knees, hips, screamed against the stillness. But he didn't move until the deer lifted its head and turned slightly, exposing the line between neck and shoulder. That was the target. That narrow point where flesh met bone, where one strike could mean everything. And then, without signal or sound, he moved. The spear left his hand in a single, fluid motion, not as an act of violence, but of precision, the culmination of countless hours spent in training that no one ever called training. It spun once, twice, cutting the air like a thrown shadow. The deer flinched, but too late. The impact was brutal, final, and clean. The animal collapsed without a sound, its legs folding beneath it, the moss forgotten, the breath escaping its body in a long white exhale. There was no shout of victory, no celebration. The hunter did not move immediately. His arm remained outstretched, fingers still open, as if the weight of the weapon lingered even after it had struck. The others emerged slowly, cautiously, not because of fear, but because they knew success in this place always came at a cost. The deer was dead. The spear was shattered, its head buried too deep to recover. The wolves would scent it soon. The wind had shifted again. They worked quickly, not wasting time with words. The carcass was light from hunger, easier to lift, but offering less reward. They bled it clean into the snow, the red pooling into the white like ink on parchment. The third man muttered something beneath his breath, a sound, a prayer, or simply a reminder to keep moving. They lashed the body between them and began the return. No one mentioned that the lead hunter's hand was shaking, or that the cold had stiffened his throwing arms so badly he might not manage a second shot. Even if he had the chance, the shot had worked. They were alive. But they knew now, more clearly than ever, that each victory in this winter wasn't survival. It was only delay. The cold always waited, and next time it would demand more. The journey back was not a march of triumph, but a slow, grinding retreat against wind and exhaustion, a silent procession through a world that seemed to grow colder with every step. The deer, tied across their backs with strips of frozen hide, no longer felt like a victory, but a burden made heavier by the growing ache in their muscles and the creeping stiffness in their joints. Snow clung to their legs and soaked through the seams of their furs, melting only long enough to chill the skin beneath before refreezing into ice. Their breath, sharp and shallow, clouded the air in front of them like ghosts pulling forward into the dying light. By the time they reached the cave, the sun had vanished behind thick clouds, leaving only a dull, gray twilight that wrapped the landscape in muted dread. The wind had dropped, but the stillness brought no comfort. It only made the sound of their footsteps seem louder, more fragile, like they were trespassing in a place meant for silence. When the entrance finally appeared between the boulders, half buried in drifted snow, they did not cheer or quicken their pace. They simply pushed forward, shoulders locked beneath the weight, knowing that rest was still hours away. Inside, the fire had not gone out completely, but it hovered close to death. A handful of embers pulsed faintly in the pit, their glow too weak to warm the space, but enough to cast flickering shadows across the stone. The others stirred at the sound of footsteps, rising slowly, not from fear or anticipation, but from instinct. Hunger had flattened all emotion. Their faces, pale and hollow-eyed, didn't smile. They didn't speak. They waited, eyes fixed on the bundle being lowered to the cave floor. It should have been a moment of relief, but the cold had turned the deer into stone. Its legs were locked, its hide stiff with frost, and even the blood that should have soaked into the cloth bindings had frozen into dark, dry stains. The kill was real, but it was not ready, and the fire, frail, flickering, unsure, was not enough. The task of survival had only just begun. They gathered around the carcass, and the oldest among them knelt beside it, pressing a weathered hand to the frozen flesh. His fingers lingered, not out of reverence, but calculation. The animal could not be cut, not like this. They needed fire, heat strong enough to thaw the outer layers, to loosen sinew from bone, to allow the stone tools to do their work. But fuel was nearly gone. The few sticks and scraps remaining were damp, brittle, useless. And yet the fire had to be kept alive, not just for the meat, but for the people huddled behind the rock wall, who had spent the day breathing smoke and silence in equal measure. One of the men began to break apart a woven mat that lined the floor, pulling the brittle reeds apart and feeding them one by one into the embers. The fire caught slowly, coughing up smoke before settling into a cautious burn. Another added the twisted bark, scavenged days ago from the base of a dead tree, while a third stripped a sleeve from his coat, offering it not out of generosity but logic. Fabric burned longer than straw. The flame, now reborn, licked at the frozen deer, steam beginning to rise from its surface in slow, curling threads. Time stretched. They worked in shifts, scraping, slicing, separating muscle from bone with stone tools that chipped and dulled with each cut. The meat came away in stiff slabs, hard and pale, too frozen to bleed. It had to be warmed before it could be eaten, but not too quickly. If it burned, they would lose more than they could afford. Every scrap was counted, every bone set aside, even the hooves, the skin, the organs, everything had value. Nothing was discarded, not in this season, not in this world. The children were fed first, not because of sentiment, but because their cries drained the will of the group faster than hunger. Small portions were passed around on flat stones warmed near the fire, bites of meat so tough it had to be chewed until the jaw ached, but none of it was refused. Each swallow was a quiet negotiation with the body to keep moving, to keep waiting, to survive another stretch of dark. But even in this moment of sustenance, the air remained heavy. The success was real, yes, but it was thin, temporary, almost brittle. The meat would not last. The fire would not last. The cold outside had not retreated. It had only paused. And while the scent of roasted flesh now filled the cave, it also filled the forest beyond. The wolves would smell it. The wind would carry it. For a few hours, they would rest. Muscles would soften. Eyes would close. But no one would forget what it had cost to drag that frozen body home, and fewer still would forget how quickly that meat would be gone. Victory in this season was never full. It was always melting, always slipping through frost-bitten fingers before anyone dared to believe they were safe. The meat sizzled quietly over the fire, its scent mingling with the thick, smoky air that clung to every surface of the cave like a second skin. The flames, no longer fragile, now danced with renewed strength, fed by what little remained of mats, bark, and scraps of cloth. Shadows moved slowly along the stone walls as the people sat in silence, eyes fixed not on the fire, but on what hovered above it. Strips of deer flesh skewered on sharpened sticks, their surfaces blackening, dripping fat into the coals. Hunger made time stretch. Every second the meat roasted felt like an hour, and every breath drawn near the fire carried with it the unbearable sweetness of food not yet tasted. But as the moment of sharing approached, the silence that had once been a comfort turned rigid. There was no ceremony, no clear rule to follow, only the knowledge that the deer, though valuable, was not enough. The numbers didn't lie. Too many mouths, too little meat. And in that understanding came the fracture. The elder, the one whose voice still carried weight, even when his hands had lost their strength, sat close to the flames, knees drawn up, eyes half closed, not in rest, but in judgment. He had spoken little since the hunter's return, only watching, measuring, waiting for this moment. It was he who finally extended his hands toward the first piece of roasted meat, not to take, but to choose. He turned slightly, nodding toward the child who sat by the wall, arms wrapped tightly around her thin frame, eyes sunken but watchful. The first portion went to her, then a second to the mother beside her, though her hands shook as she received it. The hunter who had thrown the spear was next, not by request, but by silent agreement. His effort had bought them this moment. But when the elder reached again, pausing before offering the next piece, a hand reached out from the side, rough, large, worn with frost and effort. Another man, older than the hunter but younger than the elder, looked directly at him and said nothing, though the message was clear. Why her? Why him? Why not me? The elder did not answer. Instead, he lowered the meat and set it aside, returning his gaze to the fire, and with that, the balance began to tip. Others stirred. A quiet shift of posture, a cough too sharp, the subtle rise of breath that wasn't just tiredness, it was resentment. The fire, once a center of warmth, now became a dividing line. On one side, those who had received their share, on the other, those still waiting, eyes burning hotter than the flames. It wasn't about selfishness, not entirely. It was survival measured in mouthfuls. Each portion given away was a portion someone else would not get, and in that subtraction came judgment. Who was worth more? Who would live longer? Who could still contribute? One man stood, a trap maker who had lost 2 fingers to frostbite weeks before, and quietly asked, not with aggression, but exhaustion, if his share had been forgotten. Another man laughed, too dry, too loud, and replied that broken hands couldn't build snares or skin game. The tension thickened like smoke. No one raised a weapon, not yet. But the social fabric, once loosely held together by shared desperation, had begun to fray. The hunter who had carried the deer now sat apart, chewing slowly, not looking at anyone. His silence was not humility, it was distance. He had done what he was supposed to do. The rest, he believed, was not his problem. Someone suggested saving portions for the next day. Someone else objected. Tomorrow was not promised. Another pointed toward the eldest man and asked whether someone who no longer hunted should still eat first. The elder did not reply. His role was older than memory, and though his body failed, his presence still weighed heavily. He had once kept them alive with decisions made in storms darker than this one, but memory was not meat. In the far corner, the youngest boy reached toward a discarded bone, still slick with tendon. A woman slapped his hand away, not harshly, but firmly, and pressed his fingers to his chest, whispering something low in his ear. The boy began to cry, not loudly, but quietly, as if even sorrow had to be rationed. From that night on, the act of feeding would no longer be silent. Every bite taken became a statement. Every portion given became a test. The rules of the past, unwritten and old as the trees outside, had shifted. Fairness was no longer enough. It was replaced by something rawer, colder, something that had no name, but that everyone understood. A new kind of justice, carved not from tradition, but from need. The hunt began again, not with the quiet determination of necessity, but with a heavy, silent friction that clung to every movement and shadow, a sense that something beneath the surface of their unity had shifted irreversibly. What had once been instinctive cooperation now carried the weight of uncertainty, as though each man stepping into the snow no longer saw his companions as brothers, but as variables, risks, even rivals. The cold remained as bitter and unforgiving as ever, but it was no longer the only enemy pressing in on them from all sides. Now there was something more dangerous rising from within, something born of long silence, empty stomachs, and the slowly growing knowledge that the next kill might not be enough for everyone. They moved through the forest in broken rhythm, not quite together, not quite apart, their coordination subtly fractured by the undercurrent of suspicion that hummed through their steps like a low, invisible wind. Each man scanned the ground for tracks, but also glanced sideways, eyes watching hands that hovered too long near weapons, footsteps that fell too softly behind their backs. The trail they followed was faint but promising, scattered signs of movement in the underbrush, scraped bark on low branches, shallow prints half filled with fresh snow, but even this glimmer of opportunity did not ease the tension that wrapped itself around them like smoke. One hunter wanted to follow the signs west, claiming that the terrain there would funnel prey more easily into a trap. Another disagreed, arguing for higher ground where they might spot movement from above. A third said nothing, but the tightness in his jaw soon made it clear he was no longer interested in shared decisions. There was no shouting, no outright refusal, but the silence that followed each suggestion was thick with judgment, and even when one plan was chosen and the others fell into line, they did so with the slow, reluctant obedience of men who no longer believed in the wisdom of the group. As they moved deeper into the woods, the snowfall thickened, and with it came a growing sense of isolation, not from the world, but from each other. One man slipped while climbing over a ridge, and though he caught himself, the others didn't offer a hand or a word, just a glance, a pause, then continued walking. That glance said everything. You're only as useful as your footing. Later, when a shadow moved through the trees and they fanned out to trap it, their formation was uneven, timing misaligned, movements too loud and too fast. The deer, thin, alert, panicked, broke from the trees at the wrong angle, and the man meant to intercept it was too slow, or perhaps he hesitated, or perhaps he wanted to see if someone else would fail. The deer vanished into the snow, and no one said whose fault it was, but the air between them grew colder than the wind, and their eyes, once filled with shared disappointment, now held something harder. Not frustration, but some doubt. That night, as they returned empty handed, the cave did not greet them with relief or comfort. The fire was dim, the faces around it sharper than before, and the question, spoken softly but burning like a brand, began to surface. Should we stay, or should we go? Some whispered of leaving, heading south where the snow might be thinner and the rivers not entirely frozen. Others scoffed, saying that to move now was madness, that the forest would consume them before they found new shelter. But beneath these arguments was something deeper, something unspoken and far more dangerous, the sense that the only thing holding the group together was the fear of being alone, and even that fear was starting to weaken. They began to eat in smaller clusters, speaking less, sleeping with one eye open and hands closer to their blades. The roles that had once kept order, elders, hunters, caretakers, began to blur as hunger made every man equal and equally expendable. A glance lingered too long. A portion looked slightly larger, a suggestion of favoritism in how the meat was shared, a moment of hesitation when someone asked for help, and the cracks widened. What had held them together against the elements was no longer enough to hold them together against themselves. And though no one said it aloud, they all knew. The cold outside could be endured, but the cold between them was spreading faster. Trust, like firewood, was finite, and now it burned too quickly to be replenished. Desperation has a way of peeling back the layers of a man's pride until all that remains is instinct, and when instinct fails, what remains is memory, not the memory of the individual, but the deeper kind, passed down through firelight and scars, through stories spoken in flickering shadows and gestures carved into stone. As the hunts grew longer and the kills more elusive, as the wind began to feel not just cold, but personal, biting through flesh as though it knew where to hurt, the hunters turned away from logic, from recent plans and failed tactics, and began to reach backward into a time older than any of them could name. No one declared it out loud, but each of them began to remember things they had once dismissed as tales for children or the ramblings of the dying, stories of paths hidden beneath the snow that only reveal themselves when the moon sits low, stories of markings etched into boulders long ago by hands now turned to dust, not as decoration, but as direction. The first of these symbols was found by accident, or perhaps not by accident at all. One of the younger hunters, half delirious from hunger and fatigue, stumbled off the main trail while chasing what he thought was movement, and there, half buried beneath ice and lichen, was a stone unlike the others, flat, angled with a notch cut across it that pointed west. He called to the others, and together they scraped away the snow and traced the groove with frozen fingers, not understanding it fully, but feeling something shift in the air around them, as if the forest had just remembered their presence. From that moment, they began to follow not just animal tracks, but signs, subtle alignments of trees, clusters of rocks shaped unnaturally, the kind of patterns that the rational mind might dismiss, but that the starving mind embraces like prophecy. They started to move differently, no longer scanning the ground, but looking ahead and above, letting their feet be guided by shapes and shadows that seemed to echo something ancient. The elder, who had grown more silent with each passing day, now walked with purpose, muttering not to the others, but to the trees themselves, recalling fragments of chants once whispered in the dark corners of their old shelters, words meant not to summon gods, but to awaken memory buried deep in the bones of the earth. He spoke of migration trails carved into the minds of beasts as surely as into the minds of men, of valleys where the animals always returned after the storms, of rivers that ran beneath the snow and drew thirsty prey in even the harshest seasons. No one mocked him. Not now. The trail they followed began to resemble less a path and more a rhythm, a series of decisions that felt intuitive rather than deliberate. They came across a fallen tree marked with ancient burn scars and stopped not to rest, but to listen, not with ears, but with attention sharpened by silence. And there it was again, the sound of something moving in the distance, steady and slow, too deliberate to be wind. Not prey yet, but the promise of it. They pressed forward, their feet no lighter, but their hearts steadier, as if each step carried not just their weight, but the weight of those who had come before. For the first time in weeks, they reached a clearing where the snow had been disturbed not by storm, but by passage, tracks, old and softened but real, hoof prints, shallow scrapes near a stand of frost-bent trees, and just beyond, a stream not frozen entirely, its surface broken by trickling water. The place was real. The stories were true. The elder did not smile, but he stood taller, as if the world had just nodded back at him in recognition. Here, the hunters laid down their weapons, not in defeat, but in reverence, carving a new mark into stone, adding their presence to the thread that wound through time. The cold still pressed against them, the hunger still gnawed, the wolves still lurked beyond the tree line, but for the first time, they were not merely surviving. They were remembering, and in that remembering, they became more than scavengers, scraping life from a frozen world. They became part of something older, something vast and enduring, something that had seen winters worse than this, and yet continued to whisper the way forward. The decision was not made in council, nor forged through debate, but rather emerged slowly from the silence, like a shape taking form behind a wall of frost, something that had always been inevitable, waiting only to be seen clearly. No one appointed him, no one gave a command, yet when he rose before the first light, breached the snow-choked horizon, and began binding his furs with the thick leather cord passed down from his father, everyone in the cave knew what he intended, and no one tried to stop him. There were no words of encouragement, no rituals to bless the path ahead, just a long moment of stillness as he met each pair of eyes around the fire, and found in them not fear, not doubt, but resignation, the kind that comes when hope has thinned too far to be shared and must instead be carried by one alone. He left before dawn, stepping into a wind that had no direction, only force, a weight that pushed against his chest with every breath and screamed through the trees like a creature without shape or mercy. The snow was not soft powder, but dense, frozen in layers by a dozen thaw and freeze cycles, cracking underfoot, with sharp, echoing sounds that made him wince with each step. Visibility was reduced to a narrow corridor between falling flakes and low clouds, a tunnel of white that twisted perception and made every hill look like the last. But still he moved, his spear strapped tightly across his back, his breath shallow to conserve warmth, his fingers clenched not just from the cold, but from the knowledge that each movement might be his last chance to alter what seemed already decided. Behind him, the cave held more than people. It held a future frozen in waiting. The old man who could no longer hunt, the woman whose belly had only just begun to swell, the child whose feet had gone numb 2 nights before and hadn't warmed since. They had eaten the last scraps the evening before, chewing dried sinew until it dissolved into a paste of fatigue and memory. There was nothing left to stretch or ration, only the fire, barely sustained, and the stories they clung to about men who walked into storms and returned with salvation. He didn't believe in legends, but he knew hunger, and he knew that when a group cannot move forward, someone must. The cold deepened as the hours passed, not gradually, but in sharp, sudden drops that forced him to stop, brace himself, and continue through the pain. His skin beneath the furs had gone numb, and he no longer trusted his feet to tell him where the ground was soft or solid. Twice he stumbled, once hard enough to drive the breath from his lungs, and for several seconds he simply lay there, staring at the sky, blinking against the flurries that danced downward like ashes. But then he arose, not from courage but from memory of the child's hand tugging at his sleeve, of the woman's quiet song near the fire, of the smell of meat roasting that last night before the snow took the world. By late day, when the sun was no more than a pale disk behind clouds, he saw it. Fresh tracks, deep and unshaped by drifting snow, wide set, heavy, not deer, elk, alone, injured perhaps, judging by the dragging mark between prints. He crouched low, pulling his hood tighter, and began to follow. The world narrowed further until there was nothing but his breath and the trail. The wind dropped, not out of mercy, but because it had no more to take from him. His fingers had lost sensation entirely, and when he gripped his spear, he had to look to make sure he still held it. The forest ahead was dense with broken pines, branches heavy with snow, and somewhere within that curtain of gray moved the thing that could save them. He didn't plan. There was no time, no second attempt. As he entered the thicket, the elk turned, startled, its side gashed, breathing in hard, sharp bursts. It reared, uncertain whether to run or fight, and he, with the last strength he had, raised the spear in a single fluid motion born of training older than language, and let it fly. The moment stretched beyond time, frozen midair like everything else in the world, until the point struck true, not perfectly, but deep enough. The elk crashed forward, legs folding, body trembling against the snow as the last strength drained from it. He collapsed beside it, not in victory, but in collapse, chest heaving, head spinning, his body no longer entirely his own. There was no shout of triumph, no rush of joy, only the faint realization that he was not dead and the elk was. That would be enough. When he rose again, it was dark. The snow had lessened, and the cold was no gentler, but the air felt changed. He began the slow process of cutting what he could carry, wrapping the meat tight, lashing it to his back, moving again through the forest that now watched him not as prey, but as something else. Every step home was agony, each movement a question, but he answered them all the same way. One more. He returned not with enough to save them forever, but with enough to keep the fire burning, to warm the child's hands, to keep one more day alive. And in the eyes that greeted him, wide with disbelief and quiet awe, he saw not thanks, but relief, the kind that comes when a group teetering on the edge is pulled back not by force, but by one man's refusal to surrender. That night, they carved a mark into the stone beside the fire, the same shape etched into 100 other caves by 100 other hands in 100 other winters. It meant survival. It meant memory. It meant that even in a world ruled by ice, one step could carry the weight of all who followed. The cave appeared through the falling snow, not as a shape, but as a suggestion. A darker smear against a world drained of color, a promise remembered more than seen. His legs no longer moved with intention, but out of habit, one dragging behind the other in a rhythm half broken by pain. The bundle of meat across his back, frozen solid and fused to the furs by ice and blood. His face, cracked and pale, had lost feeling long ago, and he no longer blinked against the wind, not because it had softened, but because even the wind had become part of him now. With every step he took, the world behind him stretched further into a kind of silence that no longer belonged to the living. Only forward remained. They saw him first as a shadow, a shape swaying beneath the weight, and for a breathless moment, no one in the cave moved. Then a cry, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the air, escaped from one of the children near the mouth of the shelter, and suddenly everyone was rising, not in chaos, but in quiet disbelief, as if they were unsure whether they were seeing a man or a memory. When he collapsed just past the threshold, dropping to his knees and sliding forward onto the packed snow, hands still clenched around the bindings of the bundle, they surrounded him, not with celebration, but with awe. They helped him to the fire, lifting his limbs like something sacred and fragile, laying him down not on cold stone, but on hides warmed for this possibility, the hope none had dared to voice aloud. The bundle was unwrapped with care, its contents revealed piece by piece, meat darkened by cold, but clean, lean, real. It would not feed them forever, but it would feed them now. The fire surged as new fuel was added, flames licking higher, as if sensing that it too had been chosen to continue. Children were given the first bites again, and this time no one questioned why. The old man took his place near the wall, eyes never leaving the fire, hands resting on his knees, his voice quiet but steady as he began to speak, not about what had just happened, but about what had happened long before. He told them a story, one passed down from others who had sat in caves like this, on nights like this, when the world outside had turned to ice and the line between death and endurance had become as thin as a breath. He spoke of a time when the cold had nearly swallowed the sky, when food had vanished and the earth had gone silent, but a man had walked into the white with nothing but a spear and returned with the warmth of life on his back. Some listened with wide eyes, others with closed lids and slowed breath, but all listened. Even the man who had returned, half asleep and trembling, listened. Outside, the storm did not rage, but it did not stop either. The wind whispered along the rocks, the snow continued to fall, and the forest remained still. Winter had not ended. Its grip was still tight, its hunger still vast. But for the first time in many nights, the fire inside the cave was strong, and the people around it were not just surviving, they were remembering. The man who had walked alone was no longer just a hunter. He had become a story, a piece of something larger, something that would be spoken again when another winter came, and someone else would rise before dawn, wrap their furs, and walk into the white, carrying with them not just a weapon, but the echo of this night, when one step through the snow lit a fire bright enough to keep the darkness at bay.